Greetings and welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one is the first of two that deal specifically with experiments. Remember, experiments are research that are done in order to establish cause and effect. I have other videos explaining the difference between experiments and descriptive research and so forth. But this one specifically is going to deal with variables. Now, variables have a very, very difficult definition. Note the sarcasm in my voice. Variables are things that vary. And yes, indeed, you do. That is the definition. Variables are things that vary. They are things that change. Now, when we're talking about experiments, there are generally three different types of variables. Now, I am kind of simplifying this somewhat. If you ever decide to take a research methods course, whether in psychology or biology or any other science, trust me, we're going to go into a lot more detail at that point. But this is simply an introduction. There are three different types of variables, and luckily they're named pretty much what they are. A lot of things in psychology are actually named exactly what they are. So you need to less memorize the exact words and the exact definition that I give you, if that's possible, and more just think about what the title says to you. Because very often, not always, but very often, the name of it will tell you what it is. The first are called independent variables. Now, an independent variable is controlled by the experimenter. It's independent in the experiment, okay? The experimenter is the one that controls it. The experimenter decides what it is. Specifically, if we're talking cause and effect, the independent variable is the cause. If you say that A causes B, then A is the independent variable, okay? If they're doing research on a medication and they say that this particular medication will cause a change in symptoms of schizophrenia, for instance, or bipolar, or anxiety, or whatever, okay? Then the medication that you're talking about is the independent variable, it's the cause. Now, if we have an independent variable, we're also going to have a dependent variable. Now, it's called the dependent variable because it depends on the independent variable. Remember, the independent variable doesn't depend on anything. It is set by the researcher. The dependent variable depends on the independent variable. It's the effect in cause and effect. If you say that A causes B, then B is the dependent variable. The independent variable causes the dependent variable. In that example I gave you before, where we're looking at medication, if the independent variable is the medication, the dependent variable is any change in the symptoms. And that's usually, by the way, how it's phrased. We can't know for sure whether or not a medication is going to do anything. And in fact, sometimes medications make things worse. So usually it's phrased in your hypothesis as it will cause a change in the dependent variable. Okay? It's an effect. So the nice thing here is if you have a question and they ask you to pick out the independent variable or the dependent variable, all you have to do is look at that experiment and phrase it as A causes B. I mean, that's simple. It could be A causes a change in B or A modifies B. I generally like to just basically say A causes B, because that way, for one, you can be sure that what you're talking about is an experiment. At least your hypothesis is sure, because experiments deal with cause and effect. But the other thing is, once you have it as A causes B, that gives you your variables. You know exactly what they are. So whenever you're given an experiment and they ask for a variable, don't just sit there and try to psych it out, okay? You don't have enough experience to do that. Simply write it down or phrase it in your mind as A causes B, and there you are. But unfortunately, generally, things are a lot more complicated than that. For instance, if we're talking about that medication, we're going to give somebody a medication. This medication will cause a change. Let's use depression, because that's a biggie. It's not only a rather large one in our particular culture, but it's also a biggie in terms of actually testing medications. So, we're going to say that the independent variable is a medication. The dependent variable is any change in a person's mood. And so if we're going to test this, okay, cool. We got our hypothesis, testable prediction. This medication will cause a change in someone's mood. And so therefore, you get a whole bunch of people together and you give them all who are depressed, you give them all this medication, and then you check to see what, if anything, happens. There's a problem because you basically can't be sure that you're ruling everything else out except for the independent variable. Because remember, that's what you need to do. Depression is tricky. Because sometimes depression just goes away by itself. It's called spontaneous remission. It just vanishes. And so after these people have taken medication for 6 months and you look at the results, then they may be better. But you don't know for sure that it's your medication that did it. It could very well simply be the passing of time that caused these people to get better. Or it could be maybe they were depressed in the winter and in 6 months it's summer. Maybe they have seasonal affective disorder, which seems to be linked to the amount of sunlight that people are exposed to. And therefore, as in summer, they're going to feel better. A lot of people have this, particularly people living in the northern parts of the northern hemisphere, or for that matter, the southern parts of the southern hemisphere, where the nights get very long during the winter. You tend to see a lot. So maybe the medication did nothing. Okay? Maybe people somehow changed their lives during that 6 months and it got better. Maybe the employment rate got better and so we have less depression and it wasn't the medication at all. What you need to do in an experiment is you have to get rid of all those other possible causes. Those other possible causes are called extraneous variables. They're extraneous. They are not the independent variable or the dependent variable, but they could have an effect on the dependent variable. Anything that could have an effect on the dependent variable that isn't the independent variable is an extraneous variable. And researchers try really hard to get rid of them. They're sometimes called confounding variables because they basically screw up, they confound your research. And researchers spend a lot of time trying to get rid of these. They spend a lot of time trying to avoid these. And one way that they use to get around these, to try to control for these, since you can't necessarily get rid of them entirely, you try to control for them, is to use more than one group in your experiment. Instead of just having one group you give a drug to, you have a second group. More about that in the next lecture.